We are slaying monsters.
Don't let the ghosts and the ghouls disturb you, darling.
So when I was a little kid, I had a dragon imaginary friend that was as real as anything that you can even imagine. And it was so real that when I went to the lake we would drive up to the lake and we had to pay to go to the lake. I would ask the person at the window to please pay for the dragon in the back seat as well. And my mom was like, I'm not paying more for nothing. But the woman and my mom played along very nicely for me. And they, I know that that's what she was thinking, but they were both being very good sports. And so the lady was like, okay, and an extra ticket for the dragon. And then I got to have my dragon come and play at the lake with me. And it's all because of this movie, Pete's Dragon. Or Puff the Magic Dragon, one of the two. It was so this dragon friend was my friend for a while, and then I grew out of it at about the age of 18. So I'm just kidding. But
I'm just kidding. He's still around.
He's still here, yeah.
He lives in the closet.
Yes.
Do you remember there was actually an animated kids Puff the Magic Dragon? There's a cartoon. Mm-hmm. Does anybody remember this?
I remember the live action one.
I remember it. I didn't watch it. We didn't have cable until I was much older. So if it didn't come on a public channel, then we didn't see it. But I remember that it existed.
My great aunt taped it for me. And so I had a VHS of it that I watched. And I don't... What a weird ass thing to show kids.
Why?
Well, the song Puff the Magic Dragon... is not really about a dragon, right?
Right, that's what they say anyway.
I mean,
but the writer doesn't say that. The writer says it's about a dragon.
It's ambiguous at the very least, right? Mm-hmm. And so it just seems very strange that was a thing that they presented to kids, and they were like, here,
The kids didn't know, and
No.
I feel like we were a lot more. Back in my day, I feel like we were a lot more honest with children. I mean, to be fair, I don't watch the children's shows now, and I hear really great things about Bluey, but children's shows were a bit more wide-ranging than they are now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of think you're right. I don't know. And I don't remember the show, so maybe it was fine. I don't know. It's just when I learned about the song later on, I was like, well, why did they make this into it? Also, why did capitalism win on that thing? Who was like, yeah, let's fucking sell out this Beatles song?
It's not a Beatles song. I thought it was Peter, Paul, and Mary or something.
Peter,
like
Paul, and
that.
Mary. Yeah, not Beatles.
Yeah.
Peter, Paul, and Mary. But yeah, corporatism
Did Peter, Paul, and
wins.
Mary write that song, or did they just cover it because they were thinking about it as the metaphor? That's my question. Because I always assumed that they covered it, that they didn't write it.
Oh, man. I mean, this is now a whole other deep dive.
I just wanted to talk about my imaginary dragon.
What was your imaginary dragon's name?
I don't know. I think his name was Draco, but I might have put that on him later on. I'm not sure I remember his name.
Draco was the dragon from Dragonheart. Dragonheart? Yeah.
I guess so. That was a good movie, too.
Was he in Slytherin?
Slytherin, probably.
Crossing worlds. Sorry.
Puff the Magic Dragon was based on a 1959 poem by Leonard Lipton from Cornell.
Okay, very good to know. By the way, we are slaying monsters. Before the audience completely falls asleep.
Fantastic, I love
We
it.
got Maddie J across the table.
Yo.
And we have Katie with us today.
Hey, Katie.
Hi.
And I'm EJ, and we're going to talk part 2 of, wow, I almost said The Beast of Bray Road. I am it is early, guys. It's early. We're going to talk about Doc Shiels and dragons.
Doc Shiels. Well, sort of dragons. We're going to talk about water dragons, sea monsters. In a moment. But we're going to talk folklore, especially for this episode, because Doc Shiels, he's coming at this as a surrealism, this magician. He's kind of merging these two worlds of his magic history, that he grew up watching these traveling magic acts, and the surrealism art that he has been sort of embroiled in for the past decade or so of his life. He's about to smush them all together into a project, an actual artistic project that will bring some monsters to life. Monsters of his own creation at first. In our last episode, magician and surrealist artist Tony Doc Shiels has established himself as a traveling magician in West Britain. He's got a foot in both the art and the magic worlds, and he's got a fascination with monsters and the occult, and he has become obsessed with the idea of creating a character version of himself. His inspiration came from another prominent magician, one whose publicity stunts had already established himself as a household name. That's a magician named Uri Geller. Now, we've talked about Uri Geller on the show before. EJ, I know that you know all about Uri Geller because I scream at you about Uri Geller.
Yes, he corners me a lot about Uri Geller. Yes.
Katie, do you know about Uri Geller at all, the magician?
No, I do not.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, Katie.
That's okay. Fill me in.
So Uri Geller is like one of the great magic grifters of all time. He started his magic career doing relatively small tricks at parties, and then eventually got to television. And his signature effect was spoon bending. So he would take a spoon and claim that it would contort into a U shape with only the power of his mind.
I knew the name, and I knew the name because you mentioned him before, I think in a 40 Roundup that I was in.
Yes, we were talking about remote viewing because the Project Stargate, which is the American CIA program, brought in Uri Geller when he had become very famous and established, and were like experimenting on him to see if any of this magic was real. The CIA decided that it was. It wasn't, but the CIA was very wrong.
Cool. Okay.
Anyway, the spoon bending that Uri Geller was doing was actually a pretty well-established illusion even at the time. Like, magicians who saw him do it knew how he did it. And I mean, to be perfectly clear, the way that he did it is that he was using a very particular metal spoons. It would be a metal that could easily bend. And then he had this very sneaky, very, very quick way of holding it. He would hold it and he could bend it very quickly without making it look like he was bending it.
I don't understand why somebody like him would do this when we have magicians, thousands of magicians out there that can just say, yeah, that's not real.
Well, we're talking here like the 1960s and 70s. The world's a little different. Most of what he was doing up until he became like super famous and ended up on television was just smaller shows. I mean, he started out just doing like parties, but then he did smaller shows at smaller theaters, and to be fair, there's sort of an unwritten type of, well, there's actually a written and then an unwritten magic code, but you don't want to steamroll over people. Like, as a magician, I don't go to a magic show and say, I know how he did that. It's just kind of rude. So for a while, I don't think that the magicians were willing to do anything about that because he was just performing magic effects. And it wasn't until he started saying, by the way, I'm a real wizard, that the community started to sit up and take notice and say, whoa, buddy. So
they did eventually. Okay.
Well,
that's good.
Yeah, in the form of James Randi.
Right.
So okay. James Randi, who's a very renowned skeptic with a magical background, he kind of got offended that Uri Geller was using this effect to pull one over on people. And he worked with Johnny Carson and said, you should have Uri Geller come on the show, and I will make sure that we really test the effect to see if he's being legitimate or if he's lying. So Carson brought Uri Geller on the show, and knowing that the way that Uri Geller approached the effect, James Randi forced him to use prepared spoons, which were of firmer metal and wouldn't bend as easily. And so this show just consisted of Uri Geller sitting on the couch with Johnny Carson for half an hour. And he would kind of like sometimes wave his hand over the spoons and say like, I'm going to try to feel if there's one that calls to me or something like that. And then eventually he said that I don't feel strong today. I can't perform anything. And Johnny Carson basically laughed at him the whole time.
So he didn't buy it. The audience didn't buy it.
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it basically made a fool out of him.
Wow.
But then, as you said, it didn't stop him.
It didn't stop him.
Right.
Though. I mean, he got booked on Merv Griffin later on. And the thing, this is a fascinating thing about the way that people perceive this. Because the audience members claimed that if he was performing tricks, they would work every single time. But if it was real, like a demonstration of real telekinetic or psionic ability, it wouldn't work every time. Sometimes he would not feel strong. Sometimes it would be harder to do.
I also feel like he didn't break character, and that's the important thing. Like, he kept it going. I feel like we see a little bit of that today, right? Like the way that you keep something going, even when people don't believe it or people think it's stupid or people are against it, is you just don't stop. Like, people say no and you say, I didn't hear you. Like,
no, absolutely. Yeah, he was still that magician. He was just a magician who wasn't, or not even a magician. He was still that like superpowered individual because he didn't claim that he was a magician. He claimed he could actually do this. He was just like, I'm not strong. Sorry, I'm feeling a little bit weak today. And I guess then you think of it like sometimes even the best athletes have off days, and that's how people treated him. But it was a magic trick. He wasn't having an off day. He literally couldn't bend those spoons. They were too firm for him to perform his effect on. Later on, in 1996, he was on another show that had not exactly candid cameras, but a bunch of different camera angles. And one of them actually captured an angle of him bending the spoon. So we have visual evidence that he bent the spoon on camera.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Because what he would do,
super fascinating.
he would show you the spoon, this is a regular old spoon, and then he would just hold it in such a way, he would bend it a little bit, and then he would use distractions and misdirection, bend it a little bit more, each time. Yeah, but we have from this 1996, he's at a dinner table, and you can see him as he gets up from the dinner table, hold the spoon between his two hands, and then a beat later, it's fully bent. So it goes from like just barely bent to being fully bent, and he was holding it between his two hands in the intervening time.
Wow. Were the people intending to catch him, or it was just like a more modern thing where there are just more cameras than we used to have in situations?
Yeah, it was just more cameras. And I think he wasn't ready for it. As a magician, you always kind of want to think about where the audience is looking. And I think he was thinking about that, but he didn't quite know what the cameras were capturing. So the people were totally blown away and believed him, but the cameras didn't lie. By the way, he sometimes claims that his powers were given to him by aliens, in case you want to like really dial up that bullshit.
Oh, wow. I mean, what a crossover episode.
Yeah. Yeah, just when our audience thought that we were done with aliens for a minute.
Literally,
No.
yesterday, he tweeted about how some disclosure was coming this year and how he was like going to be part of some disclosure coming out of the Pentagon about aliens.
Wait, who?
Uri Geller.
What?
Yeah. He's still doing this shit all the time, man.
I didn't know he was still around.
Oh yeah, he's still around. He's as crazy as ever. And as full of shit as ever.
Still playing his part.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
We'll wait for that.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Yeah, set your clocks. So Katie, I love that you brought up that he stayed in character, because that was the thing that really resonated with Tony Shiels. He built this character. Uri Geller was this magical, gifted individual, and he was always playing that part, even throughout his entire rise to fame. And that was something that Shiels watched very closely. Now, as a magician himself, he knew immediately that Geller was faking his illusions, knew immediately how he did it. But he also understood that the illusion wasn't bending the spoon, but was making the audience believe that you could bend the spoon. In a way, this is a very similar act to Robert Houdin, who we had talked about before. Remember, he gave the illusion this impression of being a very dapper gentleman who would always be honest and fair in what he was doing. This was when that was a big important thing in society, that a gentleman would never lie to you, right? Geller was doing something very similar with his act. The spoon bending was less of an illusion than the fact that Geller was claiming that he could bend the spoon. If you bought that he was this enlightened being, not just a magician pulling a trick, then his tricks became secondary. And like you said, it doesn't matter if he can't do it, because you've already bought into Geller's a magician, or Geller's a psionically gifted individual. In 1975, Doc Shiels published the book The Shiels Effect: How to Become a Psychic Superstar.
Yes. I love the title.
It's a great title.
Bought in.
In it, he explained Geller's spoon bending, but he also detailed his rise to fame and how the personality was the real illusion. That's the real effect. And he also begged a question, one which would define the remainder of his career. This is a quote from the book. In my opinion, a big-time witch could be trained and promoted in a similar way to that of any psychic superstar. Let us invent a young witch. We'll call her Psyche. There would be a great publicity value in Psyche offering to visit Loch Ness and call up the monster from the deep. And if a photograph of the monster is grainy and out of focus, it is accepted far more readily than a slick, detailed shot.
He's sort of giving away early on that this is all an act by what he said in that book. Like, the whole point is playing the role or be this character. That's half of the battle. That's like, just make people think that this is who you are. Yeah. And there are people that are like, oh no, he really was doing this. But in the book itself, he says, no, this is like performance art.
He set it up, which I think it kind of makes the whole thing like even cooler to me that he did it, because he wrote a book about how do you fool people into thinking something. And then he just went and did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was never cagey about what he was doing. You know, whenever you watch interviews with him, whenever you read anything about it, sometimes he'll kind of grin at you and say like, yeah. But even in the one interview that I saw, he said something about how the key is to put yourself in the right place at the right time. You know, and he's always kind of, these things happen around me and then I take credit for them. So even that is kind of his explanation. But yeah, I mean, he wrote a book for it. He left a paper trail for anybody who actually did the legwork to research him. It's just that nobody did.
Or they did and they just didn't want to believe it.
It would take 20 years for someone to actually go through everything and find out all of this.
Oh wow, nobody even read his book?
I mean, I'm sure some people did, but not enough to follow everything. Also, in a way that we'll talk about very quickly, he kind of disguised himself, because sometimes he was the face, but sometimes he was the guy that got brought in because somebody saw a monster and they were like, can we get an expert in here? What about Doc Shiels? He's a monster expert.
Okay.
Okay. The more I hear about this guy, the more I admire him.
I know, he's smart.
One of my favorite quotes from the book is this, because I think it shows the entire thing. I think those medieval monsters are due for a comeback. And Cornwall, where he calls home, is the perfect place to establish this comeback and for him to set up his false coven. Because Cornwall has a reputation for witches. Now, we're talking long before the Salem witch trials in the U.S., Cornish judges were hearing cases of women performing these dark arts. Way back, 1541, 200 years before Britain outlawed witchcraft, right? There was a woman named Anne Piers who appeared on trial. Anne Piers lived in Padstow on the northern shore of Cornwall with her husband William and her children, her daughter Honor and her son John. John Piers was a notorious pirate, and he worked the waters off the Cornish coast, and he would capture trade ships that were going from France, Spain, Portugal to Ireland, Bristol, and back again. And then he would sell those stolen items along the coast. And his mother, Anne, participated by brokering a lot of the deals for him, either while he was at sea or being like the face of the organization, but the person who could like move amongst the regular people.
Wait, so his mother was Anne and his wife was Anne?
Oh, no, his mother was Anne.
Oh.
He didn't have a wife.
So wait, who were the kids?
Honor and John.
Who's the mommy of the Honor and John?
Anne.
Oh, I get it. I also misheard, EJ. So Anne had Honor and John.
Yes.
She lived on the
Yes.
Cornwall coast with Honor and John was a pirate.
Yes. And
John was her son.
Yes, she was married to William. Their son was John.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
This is.
We
Whoa.
just we heard Anne, we heard you say her husband, we heard you say her kids' names, and then we just assumed John was her husband and not
Yeah,
her
John was
son.
the pirate. Because
Yes.
what's William doing? What the hell is this schlep doing while his son is off being a pirate? Come on.
I don't know what William was doing there. I really don't know. But so anyway, in October of 1581, John Piers finally got captured. And the public notice read, Piers was a notorious pirate born in Cornwall, who hath an old mother dwelling in Padstow, noted to be a witch, by whom the report said Piers hath conveyed all such goods and spoils as he hath wickedly gotten at the seas. John and his crew were tried and hanged within just a couple of days. Anne was arrested while she was trying to sell some stolen silver items. And she was tried not for theft, not for the sale of stolen goods, but for witchcraft.
Did they think she was a witch aside from John's piracy? Or did they think John was successful because she was a witch? I mean, why didn't they just try her for the fact that she was an accomplice to her son's piracy?
This speaks to the way witchcraft was sort of roped in and entwined with this desire to take down successful women as a cultural way to take care of women that you didn't want to be successful or be in your life or own property next to you or something like that. Mm-hmm. This has been a very common theme throughout a lot of modern human history.
I'm just like hypothesizing, but when you blame a woman's cunning on witchcraft, then you're taking her cunning away from her and you're putting it on the devil's influence. Where if you were to hang her with all the men, you would show that a woman has the ability to be just as cunning, just as cutthroat, just as business savvy as a man. So I feel like that's just stripping her of her own abilities.
Exactly, EJ. That's what I was thinking. If they just tried her for being a successful accomplice to a pirate, then she's a pirate like anybody else. But if she's a witch, that takes away her agency, that takes away the potential cultural respect of being a pirate, right? You're breaking the law, but some people think that's cool or would respect your business savvy or something like that. So totally agree with you.
No evidence was given at the trial other than people saying, I think she's a witch.
Typical.
And at the time, And really, again, throughout a lot of human history, you didn't need proof to accuse someone of being a witch. The Cornish Bird, which is a blog that covers the history of Cornwall, writes this. Witchcraft was a serious crime punishable by death, but it was also a crime that was incredibly easy to accuse someone of on simple hearsay, with little or no proof. Women often fell foul of petty disputes, silly superstitions, or just bizarre prejudices, which saw them accused of being a witch just for being old or unmarried, for example. Anne Piers is the earliest of the Cornish women that I have found who was charged with witchcraft, but she's also one of the women who almost certainly became a victim of gossip, bad blood, and possibly even jealousy. So her association with John Piers, the pirate, as you were saying, they didn't want her to be a pirate, but they wanted her to go down. And rather than needing to have evidence and all of this stuff with her, they could just be like, she's a witch.
I know that like community is everything back then. Like you survive and die on the community, but I would have a really hard time being around people back then when any moment they could just be like, you're a witch, and then they kill you. Like, I would rather just live in the woods as a weirdo and, like, be away from people. So nobody could do that. But then I'd be a witch, and they'd drag me out of the woods.
Yeah, I mean, you can't
There's
win.
nothing you can do.
You cannot
Especially in
win.
England, it's a small island. You're just, where are you going to go?
Or you can take the treacherous journey across the ocean, which I've read one or two accounts of crossing the ocean, and back then, and no, thank you. I wouldn't even want to do it now, so definitely not then.
Yeah, even now, it's not a walk in the park. Yeah.
Also, like 50 years after this, we had a whole bunch of witch trials up and down the New England coast here, too. So it's not like it was any better here.
That's true.
You know? Now, luckily for Anne, a dozen or so people came forward and gave sworn testimony supporting her character. And so she was acquitted of all of the charges.
That's
I didn't
great.
know that's a thing that could happen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If back in the day, you could, especially for witch trials, right? Because people were saying, oh, you know, she's, I don't know, probably ugly. I don't know. Like whatever you need to be like, I think she's a witch. The Monty Python sketch from Holy Grail, where they're dragging that woman away, and there's the whole thing about like, does she weigh more than a duck or something like that? That is remarkably close to how these things were actually conducted, like for real. It was super, super easy, and luckily it was kind of easy for other people to be like, no, she's not. She baked me cookies or some shit, and they're like, oh, well, okay, witches wouldn't bake cookies.
Yeah, plenty of people went to trial and survived.
Yeah.
Oh, so basically it was who in the town is willing to stand up for you.
Right.
If enough people of enough stature are willing to say, no, she's not a witch, then everyone's like, oh, well, okay.
Yeah, exactly. There are other ways that you could escape the noose as a witch, too, and we can talk about one of those here as well. Because the other notable witch from Cornwall was Anne Jeffreys.
Did she have a very tiny head?
No.
They just couldn't get the...
Oh, and then she just slipped out? No, it's fascinating. This
Stark.
was
No.
This was political. So she was born in St. Teith, which is a tiny little village described as near Camelford. And Camelford is apparently the location of King Arthur's castle, according to the legend. Anne Jeffreys grew up poor, and she took a job as a nanny for a wealthy family named Pitt. Watching over the children, Moses and Mary Pitt, occupied most of her day, along with, whatever other domestic duties. She was kind of a nanny / live-in maid. And most of the stories come from Moses Pitt's writings about her after he came of age. One day in 1645, while she was out in the garden, she had a seizure and fell to the ground. And when this seizure passed, Anne claimed that she had seen fairy people hiding in the bushes staring at her while she was having her seizure. She said they were dressed in green clothing and they spoke to her. Allegedly, this seizure, opened some kind of portal in her mind, and from then on, she could see and she could communicate with these fairy folk. She would dance with them in the garden. She would prepare meals for them. And in return, they would give her food when she was hungry, money if she needed it. They also taught her how to do fairy medicine, which she would actually use on the children she was nannying to help take care of their wounds and their illnesses.
Okay.
Wow. What year was this?
This was 1645.
That's bold for a woman in the throes of witch fears. Like when that's very risky behavior.
I'm also wondering, because a bunch of this you could make up or learn yourself, right? You could,
Sure.
learn herbal medicine, things like this. Where is she getting the money
Yeah, and the food.
and the food? Like, is she stealing and then saying the fairies gave it to her?
That's kind of my suspicion. I mean, we don't really know. But yes, it seems very likely to me that she showed up with a couple extra pounds, guineas, whatever. And someone was like, "Where'd you get that money?" And she'd said, "Oh, the fairies gave it to me. The fairies must have taken it out of your purse and put it in mine."
Or she's just an early Doc Shiels. She was like, this is giving me prominence in some way. People are into it. I had a magical seizure. People didn't know what seizures were, or maybe
Yeah.
they did, but not really. And now she just has magical fairy powers.
I do think, given kind of what I've read about her, I think she might have had a seizure, fallen down, and suffered some type of head trauma that started her down this path of seeing these visions and also being a little bit more bold about, things like thieving and that sort of thing.
I mean, if she actually was having hallucinations, then, she's not lying, right?
It's true.
She is seeing little people.
Yeah, she's prone to imagination. Like that's a pretty big, powerful combination. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, the thing is, these fairies also told her the future because the fairies were apparently clairvoyant. Sure, why not? She predicted that Charles II was going to assume the throne, which he then did 15 years later. Which wasn't really that big of a stretch, considering Charles II was basically the de facto monarch since 1649, after his father was executed. He just wasn't able to officially claim it as his because there was some political infighting involving Oliver Cromwell and an uprising movement that was called, no lie, the Rump Party. Mm-hmm. This all led to the English Civil War, which unseated and executed Charles I and tried to install a non-monarchy government in his place. Now, as you can guess, seeing fairies and using fairy magic was not good, right? It was not great for her. Mm-hmm. But claiming the monarchy was returning was even worse. Anne was pegged as a royalist, falling on the side of the Stuarts. And so she was arrested on charges of witchcraft and sent to the Bottom Gaol, which is a jail in Cornwall. While there, she claimed that the fairies snuck through the bars and brought her food, which helped her to survive. But you see how this was a problem for the magistrate, right? Because you have this woman who is claiming things that are essentially overthrowing the government that they are working so hard to keep in place. Like, we don't want a monarch government right now. And she's the one who's like, the fairies tell me that the monarchy is coming back.
Which I'm sure they were afraid of.
Exactly.
Because Charles II was still around.
Yes. So now you have this very complicated problem for the magistrate. There's not much evidence against her, since nobody else has actually seen the fairies. But if they put her on trial, they risk giving her a platform to pontificate from, and then they might upset the Rump's already shaky hold on this country. So in the end, she was very quietly released on the promise that she would not return to her work. And so she moved to Padstow, and she married a bailiff and lived out the rest of her life very uneventfully.
I think their first problem was they were called the Rumps.
I know, the Rump Party.
I think if they had a better name, there would be no monarchy in England right now. That's my theory.
No one wants to vote for the Rumps. But that's the other thing. So sometimes, you were accusing people of witchcraft because they had stolen goods. Like maybe they thought you had a cache of pirate treasure somewhere. They were trying to get to it. Other times there might be these political leanings associated. She was spewing things that the ruling party was not in favor of. And so that was a reason that she was accused of being a witch. Now, it's no stretch to believe that Tony Shiels, who has been fascinated with the occult, the Fortean in his really entire life, was drawn to these Cornwall witch stories. Rebel women standing in defiance of the establishment. This kind of dovetails really nicely with what he's exploring in Dada and surrealism, the kind of rejection of the more modern, the more presentable art world, the more like digestible art world. Let's do something weird instead. Let's do something that makes people sit up and take notice. And these magical powers that these women are bringing, like their healing skills, fit perfectly with the magic that he's been doing in his traveling tent show. In 1976, Shiels released a series of photos claiming to be a picture of a witch communing with fairies. Shield calls the witch Psyche, the same name that he referenced a year earlier in his book.
If only somebody had read the book.
Did he published this book, right? It wasn't like in his private papers.
No, it's a published book.
Reading is fundamental.
I truly, what was going on with reporting? Like all these reporters are interviewing him and no one bothered to like go to a library and like look his name up.
Yeah, that's crazy.
If they did, that wasn't what they reported on. Yeah. And remember, this is all his thought experiment, Like what if we create this witch persona, much like Uri Geller? What if we create this person? These photographs, they show a naked woman in the woods surrounded by tiny naked humans. In one photo, she's crouched next to them. In another, you can see the top half of Psyche's face behind a stump with two fairies sitting in front of her. The pictures are very reminiscent of the Cottingley fairies that was taken 50 years before. Do you know the Cottingley fairies, Katie? Mm-mm. EJ, I think you do, right?
Yeah, except I always think they're called the Cotswold fairies. And then...
No, Cotswold is
it's cheese.
A different place.
It's a place that's known for its cheese, not its fairies. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's cheese and it's fancy houses.
Yeah. Yes. Cotswold. I want to go. Anyway.
Cottingley. This was a series of fairy photographs taken in 1917 by two cousins, Elise Wright and Francis Griffiths. They were famously authenticated by the author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who himself was a spiritualist he kind of was very easily swayed by anything that was Fortean. So when he saw these fairy photographs, he was like, these have to be legitimate. I don't see any way that these two young girls could have possibly faked these photos.
This is the thing about Doyle. I'm sorry. This is the thing about Doyle I don't understand. It's very inconsistent because his books are very analytical and smart and, but him as a person, I learned recently, is not. Like, he falls for things. Like, he believes this stuff. And it was just such a shocking whiplash. I couldn't understand how a guy like that could write somebody like Sherlock Holmes.
Well, it's funny. He hated Sherlock Holmes.
Well, there you go. That makes sense. Why did he make him?
It's not quite that black and white, but he wrote a couple Sherlock Holmes stories. And then because they were being published in magazines and everybody wanted more and more and more, and he hated that he had to keep writing these characters in this story. He wanted to go on and do other things. But he was absolutely, like, for all of the analytical, intellectual, reasonable person that Sherlock Holmes is, that character is like the polar opposite of Arthur Conan Doyle. He buys everything. This is something we talked about with the Fox sisters a little bit, but in much the same way that, half a century prior, we couldn't believe that a gentleman would lie to you and perform magic. In 1917, nobody believed that two young girls were capable of pulling a stunt like this. These two young girls could not fake these fairy photographs. There's no way. Young girls, they're so innocent. They're so, like, cute, and sweet. They couldn't do this.
No, they have no
They would never lie to
imaginations.
you.
Right, yeah.
Fucking love
Yeah.
it. I love that these two women were like, you know what we're gonna do?
60 years. For 60 years, people debated whether these fairy photos were real, and these two girls were like, yep, they are. Uh-huh. And then finally, in their older age, they came forward and they said, yeah, we faked them. There was, and again, talk about doing your own research. There was a fucking book on fairies that these girls had. It was a children's book with pictures of fairies in it. They cut the fairy pictures out of the book and staged them, set them up to look like little fairies in front of them, and then took pictures.
Did they still have the book, or did they throw the book away?
I don't know. I don't know.
Because, you want to get rid of the evidence, but books were rarer back then, so maybe you don't. I don't know.
I don't know. Apparently their parents, their parents never looked at the book and said, "Oh, it's weird that all of these pages are cut out."
They underestimated these girls, just like with the Fox sisters. They just underestimate women all the time.
Oh yeah.
Can't imagine that they would be so creative.
Also, I know photography was less detailed in the 19 teens, but one would think that you could tell that they were paper cutouts, sitting in an environment that one had created them. I haven't seen these photographs, so I don't know, but I'm just guessing. But of course, photographic literacy was probably also low in the 19 teens because there weren't very many photographs. So
it was one of those situations where sometimes when you look at these photos, it's not that they were very well versed in photography and they meticulously planned this and staged it, but it was just a happy coincidence. Because they were paper, the light behaved in a different way. They were a little bit more translucent than they would have been if they were solid material. And so that gave a little bit more credence and made it a little bit more confusing as to how they were able to accomplish it.
The photos are good.
Yeah.
They're actually pretty. They look pretty real.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah,
I'll have
they did a
to
great job.
look it up.
Those photos, by the way, their original photos are now on display in the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford. And they're considered one of the most impressive hoaxes in history.
That's so cool.
It's very clear that Shields based his own photos on the Cottingley fairies. In fact, the shot of Psyche with the fairies in front of her face is so close that it appears to be an actual deliberate reproduction. Now, Shields' fairies, though, they're not the translucent quality that the girls' fairies are. They look like they might actually be created models. One is sitting in an identical way in two different pictures, indicating that it was probably a model that got repurposed twice. The nude witch herself, we touched on this last episode, was identified as Shields' daughter, Kate. Yes, it's weird. Yes, the 70s were fucking weird.
Yeah, that's the 70s, man.
The fairy puppet was likely designed by Michael McCormick, who was a puppeteer and sculptor. Now, he was a magician, sort of, in his own right. He had gigs at local pubs doing fire breathing and juggling. And he was accompanied by this band of homemade, what he called imps. They were these little creatures constructed from chicken bones and kind of odds and ends that he would set up on stage, and then he had ways to manipulate them while he was playing the music. So they would either play along or they would dance, and they would do this sort of thing, like a kind of a weird puppet show. McCormick's modeling and puppetry skills were so renowned that less than a decade after that, he ended up with a job with Jim Henson's workshop, and he worked on Dark Crystal and Labyrinth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he also worked on Return of the Jedi. This guy, this is a contemporary of Doc Shiels. Like, they are drinking buddies in Cornwall.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's important to really understand the significance of all of this, right? You have this guy who he's a surrealist artist. He's creating this magic character. He has some buddies, and one of his buddies is good enough that he's doing puppetry for Jim Henson within a decade. Just a few months after the first fairy photos surfaced, something else surfaced too. Literally. On March 5th, 1976, the Falmouth Packet published a black and white photograph of a sea monster with the headline, "Sir, kindly find enclosed one sea serpent."
That's a great headline.
It is.
The article, submitted by someone only identified as Mary F., included a letter and a pair of black and white photos. The photos are very high contrast, and the object in them is just kind of this black blob. But they do seem to depict a creature with a lumpy or sort of bulky body and a long neck, which is craning its neck toward the water's surface as if it's feeding. Mary F. explained that she'd taken the photos near Rosemulen Head, and that's like the southern tip of Cornwall, the very most southwestern part of the UK. Mary F. says, "It looked like an elephant moving its trunk, but the trunk was a long neck with a small head on the end, like a snake's head. It had humps on the back, which moved in a funny way."
And then this kind of goes into, okay, assuming this is Doc Shiels, which I think we know, but it kind of goes along with what he wrote, where grainy photos are better. Don't make it super clear.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he understood that. If you have a crystal clear picture, people are going to doubt it more. Mm-hmm. The whole incident lasted only a few seconds, which is why she came away with just 2 photos, apparently. Despite that, she was convinced that there was even more of the animal's body under the water, like a much bigger bulk down there, saying, "I would say it was about 15 to 18 feet long. I mean, the part above the water."
Oh, damn.
Wow.
So this is a big thing, right? Like that she claims that she saw. The Falmouth Packet searched for anyone going by the name Mary F. And they only found a nun in a local convent who was very, very confused when the paper came to her and said, "Did you take a picture of the sea monster?" Now, EJ, as you kind of alluded to, it's probably not a surprise that Mary F. was not real. Mary F. was, in fact, Doc Shiels. Mark Chorvinsky, who is one of the greatest Fortean researchers of the last 30 years, uncovered taped conversations between Shiels and the puppeteer McCormick from 1976. And on these conversations, Shiels says, "I am hoping to hoax the people of Falmouth and thereabouts here in Cornwall into thinking that there is a Cornish sea monster on the loose. It will take a bit of planning. I've started to drop a few hints here and there and encouraged a few friends to back me up on this."
Wow.
So to place this, you have this whole collection of surrealist artists and just kind of off-centered individuals, right? Who are getting together in pubs. They're drinking, they're playing music, they're McCormick has his puppet show, and they're having these conversations about, what if we make some monsters? What if we do this? What if we do that? How do we do it?
I really feel like we wasted our drinking time at Doobies in our 20s by never creating some sea monsters.
Seriously, right? We could have had one in the Delaware River.
Oh my God.
Yeah. You're right, Katie. What were we doing with our lives? Nothing.
What were we doing? What were we
Really?
even talking about?
Man.
Anyway.
Yeah. I don't even want to remember what we were talking about.
Mostly how much we hated our jobs.
Yes. Nothing as cool as this. We could have been
Yeah.
really planning something.
I know,
Yeah.
right? The news of this Cornish sea monster spreads, and the paper contacted Tony Shaw, who's a local folklorist. Now, you might remember him from our last episode because he's one of Doc Shiels' drinking buddies. Shaw immediately knows what's going on, and he contacted Shiels, and the two of them said, "It's all right, we'll go investigate this monster. This, of course, gives even more credence to Doc Shiels' persona, right? So within days, you have a Cornish folklore expert with an occultist magician roaming the shores looking for a sea monster. Shiels is calling himself a wizard, and he doubled down even more and claimed that he would use spells to lure the creature to the surface. Tony Shaw thinks the whole thing is just fucking hilarious and continues the ruse, and he's kind of the straight man to this goofy Gandalf that Shiels has created. But the whole thing gets the attention of Tim Dinsdale, who's a Reading cryptozoologist. Dinsdale has been in the game for since about the 50s, and he specializes in the Loch Ness Monster. He himself claimed to have filmed it in 1960, although his video is, just like Shiels said, too grainy and distant to really look like anything. Now, Dinsdale's theory, it's important to understand the way he came at it, to understand why he became so enamored with Doc Shiels. But Dinsdale had this theory that the Loch Ness Monster was a surviving plesiosaur. And in his version, the plesiosaur has 2 or 3 humps along its back, kind of like a camel. And these, he kind of claims, is like why you see these humped photographs in Loch Ness all the time. So it's not a sea serpent. It's not like a snake swimming in the ocean. Large-bodied reptile instead. For the record, the reason that you see humps all the time are probably pods of harbor seals. And they swim one after another. Not actually a long-necked, camel-humped plesiosaur. But anyway. So when Tim Dinsdale saw these photos of this kind of lumpy blob off the Cornish coast, it catches his attention because it confirms his theory. Sea monsters. They're long-necked dinosaurs. Dinosaurs have multiple humps on their backs. Boom. So this is for him the best possible scenario. Somebody caught a photo of what he thinks is real. Immediately, Dinsdale planned a trip to Falmouth to set up a meeting with Tony Shaw, the folklorist, who, of course, invited his buddy, Doc Shiels, the Wizard of the West.
Are we to believe that these photographs were not staged? They were just probably photographs of harbor seals that were grainy that he said were monsters?
Which photographs are you talking about?
I guess let's talk about the first one.
The ones that Mary F. sent in.
Yeah.
Mary F's photographs were absolutely fake.
They were staged.
They were
Yes.
staged.
Yes, they were absolutely fake. They
Okay.
were staged. They were most likely a model created by Mike McCormick, the puppeteer.
Oh, okay.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that wasn't clear. We'll talk about that a little bit later, when we get into how he actually created all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. But yes, they were fake. They were staged. They were never real. It was always a publicity stunt from Doc Shiels.
Okay.
Where do you think they met? Where do you think Dinsdale met the Tonys?
At a pub.
At a pub.
Yeah.
Local
Where
pub.
else?
Not the shore. Not where the monster is seen.
And
At a pub.
this started one of the other things that I love about Shiels, because whenever he meets with reporters or anybody like this, he's like, why don't we meet at the pub? And then he gets them to buy him drinks.
That's very smart.
So they meet at the local pub. Dinsdale explains, I'm really excited about this. This confirms the theory I have. And I believe that the inland lochs are connected to the sea through underground channels, and so the monsters are swimming back and forth. That makes no sense at all, because Loch Ness is a freshwater lake, and the ocean is saltwater, and so Nessie almost certainly couldn't actually survive in both conditions. Like, that's fish don't do that. It's not a thing that happens.
Also, I'm not an expert on this by any means,
Sure.
but I'm like quite sure that any underground channels that would be big enough for like something that's supposedly the size of Nessie to swim through would have to be kind of deep in the ground, or like we would know about them. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Like
mean,
if they were that deep, an animal likely couldn't go that deep because the pressure would be too great, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for there to be a channel that connects Loch Ness to the ocean. It would, like you said, to move a plesiosaur back and forth, it would have to be huge. It would have to be like the size of a house the whole way.
Yeah. That just doesn't seem likely.
Also, then Loch Ness wouldn't be fresh water. You would have salt water in it.
Right.
You know? Dinsdale ignored that gap in logic altogether and appeared on a local radio station, the Women's Hour on Radio 4. And he tried to get an independent investigation going into this Cornish sea monster. His appearance invigorated a public interest in it. And just a couple weeks later, on March 26th, the Falmouth Packet reported that another monster expert was joining the search, Professor Michael McCormick, who was a dragon hunter. Except, of course, this guy, he's not a monster hunter. This is the puppeteer who created these imps and also created the model that was used for the photographs.
Wow.
People are really just taking whatever someone says at face value. Is Michael a professor?
No.
No. Okay, I just was confirming that he wasn't, like the other guy. He wasn't like actually a professor and then he made puppets and did magic shows on the side. Like, no. Okay.
He was not.
Okay, cool. I'm glad that everyone's just confirming people's titles, fact checking, that important piece of media reporting.
Yeah. And this is like pre-internet when you couldn't check these things. Now, he did have a book. You could have read his book. But I also think that this was such a magical time in which things just were believed more. And, well, we believe a lot of shit right now, actually, that we shouldn't be believing because of the internet. But I feel like there's more mystery now. Or back then there was more mystery and you were willing to give people the benefit of the doubt because you just didn't have the social media fingerprint that you could call upon and look back on.
Yeah, but I feel like they still, fact checking was still a thing in reporting. So, you could go to, the local city hall and, look up Michael McCormick. There were ways to check people's records, just even lightly. I mean, it would... I'm not even saying you have to do a deep dive on this guy, but,
bare minimum. Yeah.
Well, also, they did a really good job of picking a small local newspaper, someone who's probably, they're doing local interest stuff. They're not really doing heavy hitting journalism.
That's a good point.
So.
They might even know that this is a little bit tabloidy, but they're like, hey, it's going to make people buy some papers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So by this point, Shiels has started calling the creature Morgwar, which is a Cornish name meaning sea giant. The BBC got fascinated by this as well and interviewed Shields outside a pub and then at Pendennis Point at the tip of Falmouth. And here in this interview, Shields, he's got a walking stick in one hand, he has an amulet in another, and he attempts to summon Morgwar, and it's unsuccessful. He explained his strategy on camera, though, and he said, "Well, I simply make myself as attractive as I possibly can to the beasties, and it's a kind of abstract invitation that's thrown out to them."
I love that.
This video was truly chef's
It was. It really was.
I love, then he claims that he actually does summon it, but it's on the other side of the point. And they're like, oh, we can't see it. And he's like, yes, damn it.
I want to know the divide of people who watched that video, knew he was faking, thought it was hilarious, respected the effort, and the number of people who watched it and thought he was serious and thought he was crazy. And then the number of people who watched it thought he was serious and were like, wow, how incredible.
Too bad it went on the other side of the island.
I know.
Yeah.
I just need to know the breakdown. We'll never know.
Yes, me too. I know.
I'll ponder forever.
They tried to ask him about the amulet that he was carrying, and he said, "Oh, I can't show you or you'll be exposed to the awesome magic it possesses."
Oh my God. I really think this is peak British humor, dry British humor.
It totally
Yes.
is, yeah.
He's so funny.
So Despite the ridiculousness of this segment on the fucking BBC, or I guess maybe because of the ridiculousness, Morgwar skyrocketed publicly. Never one to let something like that go, Shiels kept himself on the forefront. Now he became even more committed to summoning it, and he declared, I'm going to seek help from my local coven of witches, and we're going to conduct a ritual that is guaranteed to attract it. According to the Foulmouth Packet, 4 witches, including Psyche, would swim naked in Helford River, which is an inlet on Rosemullin Head. The first 2 arrived a week early and took an experimental dip in the river while nude, or sky-clad, as they called it. And despite this temptation, Morgwar did not appear.
Skyclad.
Sky-clad witches.
Dude, that's a great name for like a metal band.
Sky-clad witches.
Skyclad witches.
On April 23rd, 1976, journalists and TV news crews again descended on the Punch Bowl, a local pub, to meet with Shiels. Graciously buying him several rounds of drinks, Doc explained that the experiment was going to happen today with all 4 witches swimming nude, and then he caught a ride with one of the journalists to Durgan. He didn't drive, so he was just riding in a car with one of the journalists. Unfortunately, the witches never arrived.
What happened?
Psyche sent Doc a letter, and she declared that the events had become a circus and she had no intention of participating in a media stunt because she was going to do it for real, as a real coven summoning ritual, and now there were all these cameras and she just felt like it had gone too far.
Wow, that's really clever.
Uh-huh.
So he didn't want to disappoint the television cameras, so he tried to summon Morgwar himself by marching up and down the rocky shore and banging on a drum. But it didn't work, and the monsters never showed up. The media disbanded. One journalist went to a party and jokingly invited that Shiels should bring his witches. And sure enough, several hours later, Shiels showed up, knocked on the door with 3 naked women.
Oh, they didn't even bother to put on any clothes.
Oh my God. The commitment to the bit.
Yeah.
So he goes in this guy's party, okay? The witches start just like dancing all throughout the room. Shiels begins to telekinetically bend all of the host's silverware, performing exactly the Uri Geller bit. He's just bending everything. By the time the witches danced out, 6 spoons are bent, and Doc just kind of laughs and leaves.
Wow. He must have brought his own spoons.
He might have, or they might have just been the right metal.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Also, callback. Let's remember that the naked women he brought to a party were his daughters.
Well,
70s.
They may have been.
May have been. Okay,
They may
sorry.
have been. I don't know for certain that they were his daughters. He definitely took nude photos of his daughters.
Okay, cool.
I just think he was one of those weird dads. You know, you go to school with these kids, right? And they all have, there's that one dad that's like old hippie.
Yeah.
Like he's got like this rat tail of a ponytail and a receding hairline. And you know that he has a Congo drum in the dining room.
Also, some families, nudity is just a thing. Like in my family, no, never, right? Mm-hmm. But I know, for example, not that she's like a normal person, Heidi Klum apparently like wandered around naked in front of her kids all the time. There are families that are just like fine with nudity in a way that I think that most families, I would suspect, are not.
Yes.
And like, I don't want to take that away from them. Like, there's nothing wrong with the human body. And if you grow up just like not thinking that it's weird to have your parents wandering around naked, then I don't know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that was just how they were. Also, I don't know, dude. The 70s were a weird time. He
Also,
was
your
not,
dad is like a surrealist artist, so, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, he's not exactly like, he's not a businessman, you know? He's not like a lawyer in Cornwall, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he's this artist. He's a little already experimental. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So despite this outrageous publicity surrounding Morgwar, The legend began to take on a life of its own, too. In July of 1976, two fishers, boating out on Falmouth Bay, caught sight of something in the water. First, they assumed it was an overturned boat, and they approached to see if, something had capsized and if anybody needed help. When suddenly a head and long neck raised out of the water and looked straight at them. According to their account in the Strange But True episode, Cornish Sea Monster, it goes like this. I really wish I could do the Cornish accent because I feel like it would add something to it. I can't, so you have to just imagine it in your mind. He didn't come up roaring over, jaws open or anything like that. The old boy was quite content to look at us as we were looking at him. We've all sorts, whales and dolphins and that kind of thing, but this was nothing like that at all. It looked like a prehistoric monster. There was something about it different to anything I'd ever seen before and larger than anything I'd ever seen before. We had a 32-foot boat, and it was as big as the boat.
Huh. I feel like this is a callback to the very first episode I was on with y'all, the 40 and Roundup in December, where we were talking about how deep sea creatures or other things make appearances every once in a while. And it's a real thing. It's just not something that people see usually.
Or were these guys in on it?
They were not.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
they
this
were
is a
not.
completely independent
Yeah,
situation.
I think this was a real legitimate sighting.
Interesting.
Not of a sea monster, however. The Natural History Museum in London interviewed these fishers. And when they were shown several different drawings, both picked a plesiosaur as the closest match to what they saw. But the museum believes that it was a leather-backed sea turtle. Now, that sounds weird, right? Because when we think of sea turtles, we think of something that's maybe the size of a big dinner plate. Right?
Yeah.
But leatherback sea turtles are the largest of all turtles. They can get up to 8 feet in diameter, or 2.5 meters. It's
What?
not hard. Yeah, 8 feet. 8 feet.
Oh my God. Okay.
It's huge. It's not dinner plate, like dinner table sized. It's not hard to imagine that something of that size could have reasonably resembled an overturned boat or the body of a monster. And the way the turtle moves its head, this kind of nonchalant attitude, matches with the description of the old boy well enough that I think that's probably correct.
That does make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I knew sea turtles were, bigger than the turtles that we typically think of, but 8 feet, that's incredible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The fishers called it Morgwar. Even though Morgwar never existed. Doc Shiels made up Morgwar. And it's important to remember that, too. Like, there was no folklore surrounding Morgwar before 1976 and Mary F's photos.
Okay, so they said that because of Doc Shiels' influence.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And then what happens a lot of times is you start to recontextualize other events and other creatures, other sightings, and say, well, maybe that could have been Morgwar. Mm-hmm. But Morgwar never existed.
This is perfectly working for him.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
that's probably what he wanted to do. He wanted to get these regular people to see this stuff.
And it keeps happening. One day, while walking on Durgan Beach on the banks of the Helford River, Falmouth native Kay Payne came upon a rotting carcass. She described it as 20 feet long, decayed enough to be mostly bones. The Falmouth Packet, which has now sort of become an authority on sea monsters, wrote up her story and a description of the skull of the monster before it got swept back into the sea. Everybody started asking, is this a carcass of Morgwar? Is there possibly a population of these creatures out there? Now, shortly after the paper circulated, a 13-year-old boy named Toby Benham wrote into the paper in response. He was a self-proclaimed naturalist. He loved skeletons, and he had a collection of bones that he had found while roaming the Cornish countryside. I know, right?
Yeah.
I can only imagine his parents like trying to get him interested in other presents. Do you want to play with a BB gun? Do you want some books and stuff? And he's like, no, I want a skull.
No, it's great. It's so
love
easy
it.
to give him gifts for Christmas. You just find a bunch of roadkill and, give him...
Well,
Yeah, or you're like, here's a rock. It might be a fossil.
It's great.
Here's a rock, kid. Just so happens that Christmas of that year, he was roaming around the Cornish shores and he found a massive pilot whale skull. Now, the skull and the skeleton of this pilot whale, he said was only about 10 feet long. Toby took the skull from the skeleton later on. Carl Schuker, who's a cryptozoologist, even postulates that it might have been the same skeleton that she saw and Toby saw. Either way, Toby has the skull of a pilot whale, which he compared to the Falmouth packet's reporting on Cape Hayne's description of the skull, and they were identical.
Good for Toby.
Yeah.
I feel like this kid, he's like smart. He set these adults straight.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Toby's in it for the science.
Yeah.
Yeah. Toby's the only one who's actually doing the research.
Toby's the only one that knows how to use a library.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Ultimately, Toby's skull, meaning the whale skull, not Toby's skull, but the whale skull, was donated to his school's art department, where it was ultimately identified, confirmed to be a pilot whale skull. So Toby was correct. And it now is in the Center for Fortean Zoology in Devon.
Cool.
These incidents, the sea turtles, this skeleton that got found, it shows how well Tony Shiels' narrative was influencing the people of Cornwall. We see this all the time. All you need is this tiny kernel of the fantastical at the right time, the right place, and you get a big explosion into a hunk of Fortean popcorn. And it doesn't hurt that Shiels is continuing to embellish the monster and embellish himself, too. By November of 1977, during a walk along the Helford River, Shiels and a friend again tried to raise Morgwar. He's there shaking his walking stick, and he tempted the creature to come out of the cold water. And this time it actually did. According to his book Monstrum, Shiels said, "After I had done my bit playing the eccentric shaman, I suddenly noticed a dark, double-humped shape break the surface of the water about 200 yards distant. The creature's ugly head carried a pair of stumpy little horns and looked like the head of a gigantic snail. As luck would have it, they had a camera with a telephoto lens with them. Just happened to. And so they were able to snap two contrasty, grainy pictures of kind of anything. I mean, there's definitely something out there. If you take the story at face value, it was, I guess, Morgwar. If you're a little skeptical, it might have been a seal. There's a very small dot of a head low in the water. There's a curved body. I mean, it's Doc Shiels. It's hard to tell. Could have been a real incident where they were surprised by something they happened to have a camera. Or it could have been a setup. Could have been another model created by his puppeteer friend, Michael McCormick. But this incident, where he got a photo himself, planted a seed in his mind. And he decided the next monster he was going to raise would be the most famous of all, the Scottish water horse known as the Loch Ness Monster. And we will talk about that in our final episode.
Scottish water horse. I never think about it as...
You've never heard that?
I know we talk about the Kelpie, right? Is that the name?
Yeah. Kelpie or Selkie, depending on what culture you're talking about, referencing.
And that's the water horse, right?
Yeah.
I guess I just never I guess I never thought that's what the other name for it was.
The origins come from that.
Right. That's what, yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Go Doc. He's trying to plug in. He created his own. Now he's trying to plug in to the biggest sea monster there is.
And if you think about it in
Lake
terms of...
monster.
Yeah. Think about it in terms of art. The Morgwar, these are studies. These are his studies for the Loch Ness Monster. You know, he's working, he's developing, he's perfecting the techniques that he's about to apply. And he's gonna take everything that he's built up until this point, and he's gonna put on the grandest art show that he's done yet. It's really cool. And it creates one of the most influential Loch Ness Monster photos that's ever been taken, which is really cool.
It was a real time. The 70s was a time when I think they like went back to like the medieval times too. Like they went back to fantasizing about how wonderful the medieval times were, and like I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Excalibur.
We talked about this last time.
We did.
Yeah.
This movie is bananas. It's early 80s, but it was highly, I mean, there's so much 70s influence. I mean, you've got the big bushy hair. Merlin in that movie reminds me so much of Doc Shiels. Just the shouting and the summoning and the big lightning bolts and the noise. And I can just see the influence that, I know this was after all that, but I can see how it's almost as if Doc Shiels and all of this fantastical thought actually created this idea of Excalibur almost.
I mean, decades bleed into each other. There's very rarely like firm breaks.
Yeah, totally. And I think that if anybody wants to get into the mood of that, they should totally watch the movie Excalibur, because it's like, it reminds me so much of what's happening here.
Well, that can be our listeners' homework.
Yeah.
Before the next episode, watch Excalibur.
Yes.
And just imagine that Merlin is a hard-drinking surrealist.
Not hard to believe. Also, it's a young, sexy Gabriel Byrne is in it. So, I mean, he's still sexy, but he was sexy then.
Gabriel Byrne, do you want to come on the show?
Oh my God. That'd be amazing.
Well, great. Thank you all so much for joining us, for going down this weird road with Doc Shiels. Next time, we're headed to Loch Ness.
Awesome.
Very cool. All
I love
right.
Scotland.
Have you been there, Katie?
I have, not like extensively. I've been to Edinburgh. That's it, really.
Okay. I really
But
want
it
to
was
go.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I took
Someday
the
I'll
train
go.
up, so I got to like go through a little bit of countryside to get there from England. So
Oh, that's wonderful.
Awesome. My dream is to go fish Loch Ness someday.
it's a good one.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Catch you next time.
Bye.
Be safe out there.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Slaying Monsters, the 40 in History podcast. If you like the podcast, there's a couple ways you can show your support. You can tell your friends, you can leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform, or you can head over to slayingmonsterspodcast.com and click on the Support Us button to leave a donation. For questions, suggestions, and other feedback, reach out to us, slayingmonsterspodcast@gmail.com, and stay up to date by following us on socials at Slaying Monsters Podcast. Your support helps us grow, and we are truly grateful to have our listeners and community.